Welcome back to the Unbreakable Podcast, a journey of healing and hope. I'm your host, Christy, here with my loyal co-host, Bailey, who really just says what we're all thinking. If you thought the first couple of episodes were wild, then I've got a treat for you today. So grab a drink, grab a snack, buckle up. We're in for a tough one today. So before we go any further, I am going to give a strong trigger warning, probably even stronger than episode 1, which was the day of my accident. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the absolute most horrific day of my life and the most horrific thing that has ever happened to me. Believe it or not, was not actually the wreck itself, but this happened in ICU. So there's going to be a lot of ICU trauma. Just if you are sensitive to medically traumatic events, things like that, you may want to skip this video. If you've been around a while, then you have heard me talk about this, but what's unique about me talking about it today with you is that the first time I told this story very early on in my YouTube journey, I had a lot of questions. There were a lot of pieces to this puzzle that just didn't fit, but now I have been able to get some answers to those questions, so I feel like I can tell it in a more informative way this time because I have the facts that go along with what I experienced, whereas before I just kind of told you what I experienced. So just like we did in episode 1 and 2, I'm going to lay out medically what happened, just the medical facts, and then I will get into my perceptions and what I experienced. And then we can tie that all together. This episode will not end on a happy note, probably, but that's okay. Next week's episode is going to make you cry if you haven't cried already, but I can't wait to tell you about that. But to appreciate the good things, we have to sometimes talk about the bad things, and I'm going to walk you through the most horrific experience that I have ever been a part of. So in episode 2, we talked about how I was, those early days in ICU, they were just getting me stabilized and monitoring me and tending to me, and it was sort of pretty much uneventful after the initial injuries and all of that. Usually what happens is you go to ICU, you get better, you go to a step-down unit, and then to rehab, and then home to figure out. So I was in the ICU and intubated on the ventilator for 10-ish days. Then I was extubated, which is where they remove the breathing tube, which is a good thing. And I do remember how that felt. It was a weird feeling, and then they put this big hood thing in front of my face that was blowing oxygen in my face. And I remember seeing the ET tube when they pulled it out, and it was like black. So I've intubated a lot of people as a paramedic, but we never pulled tubes, especially tubes that have been in for 10 days or whatever. So I want you RTs and nurses out there, is that normal for, like, what does that mean? That I remember my tube being like black, and I remember thinking that was inside of me. Like it really freaked me out, and nobody ever said anything about it, but I'm just curious, is that normal? Because that doesn't seem like that would be a normal thing. So I'm kind of interested to see what you guys say about that. I don't know how it is for everybody else after they are extubated. For me, it was quite scary. I remember trying to take deep breaths, and it almost felt like the air was thin. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it felt like there was like I was breathing in air, but it was just not enough. Like it was really thin, and it was quite scary, but obviously a good thing to be off the ventilator. During this time frame, I was also having swallow tests done. I think I had more than one, and I don't think I did very well on them. In fact, I still have issues today with choking. I have to be really careful when I eat, and I really have to pay attention when I eat, just because the injury was so bad and damaged all of those nerves that control swallowing. Swallowing can be difficult for me, and I think I failed a swallow test. I'm not sure, but then I think I passed one. I really don't know. Lee could tell you, he's in the other room, but it really doesn't matter. I just remember having the swallow test, and I remember when they told me I could take a sip of something, and I wanted a Diet Coke. So I finally got a sip of Diet Coke, and then I choked on it and aspirated, and that was the end of that. Right about in that same time, I started getting a headache. I honestly cannot tell you how many days this headache went on for. It could have been 2 or 3 days, or it could have been a whole week. I have no idea. For the point of this podcast, it really wasn't worth me going back and looking through all of the paperwork. But I remember getting a headache, which with everything I had just been through, I've got an internal decapitation, I've got a halo screwed into my skull, and just a lot of trauma. A headache is not anything anybody would really bat an eye about. And also at this point, I had been discharged from neurosurgery. So neurosurgery was not routinely coming to check on me anymore because I did not have a brain injury. So there was no reason for neurosurgery to keep following up with me at that point. But I developed this headache, and this headache kept getting worse and worse and worse. And like I said, it went on for at least several days. I was also vomiting, which again, you know that something is happening because I'm telling you this story, but how many times do people have headaches and they vomit? I mean, vomiting for me and being in that halo, one of the side effects of being in the halo is vertigo, which I'm already predisposed to anyways. I've had vertigo problems for years, but I was having vertigo, I was vomiting, and now I've got this headache that nobody can control. So they were giving me more pain medicine. They were putting cold packs, like literally stacking cold packs on top of my head, and my husband was starting to get very concerned. And around that time, he started asking the doctors making rounds for a neuro consult. And he was told that there was no reason to do that I just had a headache. And he said, okay. And then like the next day, it was the same thing. He said, something is wrong. I really want to see her neurosurgeon. I want a neuro consult. And again, he was told it was not necessary. Everything looked fine. And so there was no consult. Well, if you've heard this story before, y'all know that my husband fiercely advocates for me, and he did. So on this last day that he was denied a neuro consult, the headache kept getting worse and worse, and so the nurse came in at one point and gave me some more morphine for the headache. Shortly after that, my husband said that he noticed my oxygen levels dropping, and his first thought was, of course, she's had too much morphine. He's a paramedic. He treats lots and lots of opiate overdoses. That's very common. That would be the most logical explanation for what had happened at that time. And I have a vague memory of him his face being really close to my face, and I can remember him like coaching me to breathe. But he said he watched my oxygen drop from the 90s to the 80s, and I think it got down into like the 40s or 50s. The nurse that day, I think she was just off orientation. She was new. I'm not sure, but this had not happened to her before, so she was a little bit off guard, I think. And my husband is a very seasoned medic, and I'm his wife, and he's very protective. So he started, I don't want to say yelling, I don't know, I don't remember, but he took control because he felt like the situation was not being controlled. And he told her to go get some Narcan, which is the antidote for an opiate overdose, and a doctor right now. And then they also started bagging me because while he was in my face coaching me to breathe, I quit breathing. I completely quit breathing. And a bunch of doctors and other people came in. I don't know how many people were in the room, but Lee heard them say that my pupils were blown. I also lost my gag reflex. And for the people in the medical field, y'all know how significant that is. I had a GCS at that point of 3, which means pretty much you are dead. So because they had already extubated me, and then I quit breathing, they needed to get me breathing again. So they tried to re-intubate me, but they couldn't because I had the halo. So then they went to a surgical airway. Obviously, this is the day they did my crike. Well, during all of this, my sedation, my propofol, had worn off, and it took them however long to catch it and re-sedate me. And once they did that, sometime during all of that, they had to put in an EVD, which is a drain that goes into your brain. What happened to me, and nobody knew it, was that I had a late development of hydrocephalus. Basically, what happened was, because my internal decapitation was so severe, my brain no longer sat in my skull the way that it did before. It had kind of settled a little bit. And so my CSF was not able to flow like it normally would. And so over time, it started building up and caused my brain to swell. And when your brain swells and has nowhere else to go, that's when they either cut a part of your skull out or you herniate and die. There's a big hole at the base of your skull called the foramen magnum. And my brain had started to herniate. That's what caused me to go into respiratory arrest. That's what caused both of my pupils to blow. They were non-reactive, and that's what caused the loss of my gag reflex. I essentially was this close to being brain dead, like within a minute or two. They were able to get the drain into my brain in time for my brain to not completely herniate and kill me. And then after all of that was done, then I was taken to the OR where they officially put the trach in. And then I was in a coma for a couple of days. So my sister works at UAB with the Legacy of Hope. She is a procurement nurse for the organ donation center, and she works with the organ donors. And when my brain herniated, it sent me into their system because I now met the criteria as a referral for organ donation. So she was locked out. She couldn't work because they didn't want her to see, I guess, my information. And she was locked out of their system and couldn't work while this is going on. So for 2 days, the procurement team I don't know if that's what you call them, but the people that monitor potential organ donors, they followed me for a couple of days, monitoring me as a possible organ donor. And which I should have been, because somehow after 2 days, I woke up. And I have talked to my sister, because it's so hard to wrap my brain around knowing what I know medically. But she knows more than I do, especially as far as that kind of stuff goes. And my ICU, they all know so much more than me. So I'm sure I have driven them crazy. But I've asked so many questions just trying to wrap my mind around how crazy, like what are the odds? The odds that I had that wreck and had the internal decapitation. Okay, there's crazy story number 1. Crazy story number 2, this hydrocephalus complication, it's not even in the literature. There's no, it doesn't happen. Traumatic, delayed, weeks later, delayed onset of hydrocephalus. It doesn't happen. And then, so that's the crazy thing number 2. And then number 3, I survived my brain herniating. You can Google it. It doesn't happen. And I've asked my sister, I'm like, do y'all ever get referrals and then they come out like they're discharged? And she said no. If they ever get a referral that doesn't follow through with this person passes away and they're an organ donor or whatever, it's because the referral was wrong to begin with. Like, it may be a small community hospital that enters somebody in the system that shouldn't have been entered, something like that. But you don't just get somebody whose brain has herniated and then they get better. Now I'm going to tell you my experience through that, what I remember and what I felt now that I have laid out the medical facts. If you're interested, about 1.5 years ago, I wrote a blog post about this. At the time, I felt like I could write better than I could talk about it. This is an old post, so there's a lot more information in this podcast than in that blog post, but again, I wrote it 1.5 years ago. I will put it either in a card or in the description if you would like to check that out. There's also other blog posts on there. But I remember the headache. I remember the vomiting. I remember being in agony. And I have a vague memory of Lee, like I said, very close to my face, coaching me to breathe. And I feel like I even remember him saying specifically, I need you to breathe. And again, I talked about on episode 1 where I don't remember the impact of my accident. And this is similar in that I don't remember struggling to breathe. I don't remember any, other than the pain from the headache, I don't remember there being any suffering in that moment. I may have, but I don't have memories of it. But what happened was, because I had such a difficult airway with being in that halo, they were busy trying to save my life. And the doctor that did this is the same doctor that told Lee no about getting a neuro consult. So I imagine there was some feelings on both parties about that at the time, but they had a very hard time getting an airway. I know that my SATs had dropped down into the 40s. I was blue and I was dying. And during the commotion of all of that, the sedation, the propofol had run out. Well, because they were busy trying to save my life, they didn't catch it. I don't remember, of course, I don't remember not breathing, but I remember kind of fading away a little bit. And the next thing I remember is I could hear the sound of a lot of people, a lot of panicked people. I could hear the sounds of like tools. If you've ever had a surgery and like in the OR when they're getting all the tools and stuff ready, I could just hear the sound of instruments and things being moved around. I could just hear commotion. And I couldn't move. I couldn't talk. I couldn't move anything. I had no way to tell anybody. And this was at the time they were drilling the EVD into my head. I could hear the drill. I could feel things. I could feel pain in my neck. And I knew that in that moment I was dying, and I knew that they were trying to save my life, which is odd to me that I was able to know those things. But I remember thinking, they don't know that I'm here. They don't know that I can hear them. But I remember laying there thinking, they don't know that I'm here. They don't know that I'm aware that I can hear them. And like I said, I couldn't move. And so I laid there and I was terrified. I was in pain. I knew that I was dying. So I thought, if I can just wiggle my finger, then they'll know that I'm still here. And so I laid there and I put forth every ounce of mental fortitude that I could. And I focused everything I had into wiggling my finger. And I was finally able to do it. I wiggled my right index finger. And I remember hearing a female voice say, "She's moving her finger." And in my mind, nothing happened. So in my mind, I thought, well, that didn't work. I'm still here. I'm still feeling everything. I still know what's going on. So now I'm just going to die. And to tell this story back, that I'm just going to die, that sounds so, but that's what my brain in that moment thought, that it had control over that. Like I could somehow just make a decision that I was going to die and I would die. Because if that was possible, I would have died, because I tried to. All that mental fortitude that I put into wiggling my finger, I put into willing myself to die. Because all my brain knew was, this is torture. I can't take this anymore. Wiggling my finger didn't work, so I want to die because I don't want to feel this anymore. And then the next thing I remember would have been days later after I woke up in my coma. But what happened was, during the commotion of trying to get an airway, my propofol ran out. My propofol ran out. And when I started wiggling my finger, somebody pointed it out, and I even heard that person say, "She's wiggling her finger." Well, then they realized that my propofol had run out. So they turned my propofol back on and I went back out. So in reality, that maybe was a span of a minute, less than a minute. I have no idea. It could have been 10 seconds. It could have been 10 minutes. I don't think it was any longer than a minute or so in reality. But for me, in that moment, it was slow motion to the extreme. And that was the start of my snowball of just my personal hell. When I woke up from that, I was so traumatized, and I couldn't tell anybody because now I was on a trach. I couldn't talk. Somehow at some point I was able to write something to let somebody know what had happened, but there was nothing they could do. But it was a long time before I could speak and I could actually communicate with anyone exactly what happened, and that I heard this and I heard that. And once I was able to communicate that, they realized, yeah, she really, like, I really was awake. So when I wrote that blog post, for a long time, I thought that I woke up in the OR, but I didn't. I woke up, all this, because I was dying right then, right there. All of this was done in my room at bedside, and my propofol ran out. I woke up, was experiencing the life-saving measures they were taking, and then my propofol was turned back on, and I was sedated again. But when I wrote that blog post, because no one had explained that to me, all I knew was what I had experienced, and I thought that I was in the OR for a good year. I did not get the answers to this for a good year, but that day has affected me more than anything else, I would say, because I do have PTSD from that, and it really manifests itself when I have to have another surgery, and I've gotten a lot better. But the first surgery that I had after I got discharged from the hospital, so several months later, I had to have a surgery. I've had multiple surgeries since being out of the hospital, but the first surgery I had, when they laid me on the table and I heard the tools, the OR instruments, I lost it. I freaked out, was hysterical. It really triggered that for me. And each time I've gotten better. So now when I have a surgery, I'm nervous, but I just try to be super logical, and I'm much better about those triggers. But another way I think it manifests itself, I didn't know until actually yesterday. So I've been having issues with my gallbladder the past week or so. Ended up having to go to the ER. I didn't know it was my gallbladder. I just had a sudden onset of like severe right side pain that went up into my neck and whatever. So I went to the ER and they told me they think it's my gallbladder. So tomorrow I have an appointment with a GI surgeon to see if it's my gallbladder and what's going on. But in between that and yesterday, I ran out of one of my medicines. I take Cymbalta. They actually put me on Cymbalta after this whole incident happened in the hospital because I spiraled so much, and they say that Cymbalta is a good drug for PTSD. So I take Cymbalta. I've been on it ever since I was in the hospital. Anyways, I ran out and I went 3 days without my Cymbalta, and I didn't really realize how severe withdrawal symptoms can be from Cymbalta. And yesterday, while I was waiting on my medicine, I thought I was going to die. I was nauseous. I was sweating. I was just all out of sorts. I had a horrible headache. Just felt terrible. But then the anxiety kicked in. I could feel myself like spiraling a little bit because of the things that I went through. I have so much anxiety that I guess is kind of always at the surface, but I don't walk around day to day feeling anxious. It's just kind of always there. And then like when something happens, it doesn't take much for me to get to like really start spiraling out of control. And I could feel that happening yesterday. I started getting real panicky, like this feeling of doom, and And even though the logical side of me, I was telling myself, Christy, this is withdrawal. This is in your head. You're okay. You're not dying. And I just had to keep telling myself that. And I finally asked Lee, I was like, will you please come sit with me? I am not doing okay. I just was really freaking out. And my medicine came in. He went and got it. And within 45 minutes of taking my medicine, I felt fine. So I really went on a wild little side road there, but that's another puzzle piece to this whole thing, that it's been almost 2 years, but I didn't even realize that until yesterday. And it's been almost 2 years. So these things are constantly, my perspective on the things that happen is constantly changing. But I will end this on a little bit of a happier note. So if you've been following for a while, you've probably heard this as well. But for those of you who haven't, earlier this summer, there was a trauma survivors network event at UAB Hospital, and they asked me to be a speaker. I was the main speaker at that event, and so I got to talk to a room full of very important people, trauma surgeons, neurosurgeons, a lot of nursing staff, and other support staff, and just there were a lot of people there. So Lee has always remembered that he wanted a neuroconsult. He wanted a neuroconsult, and he was told no, and he has always struggled with that. He says the only thing that kept him from really pursuing anything was the fact that I lived through it and I'm okay. I did end up having to get a permanent VP shunt. So I have a shunt here in my brain that there's a big bump here, but the tube runs all the way down into my stomach to drain off excess fluid so that doesn't happen again. But the VP shunt was the outcome of that. But I've had so many questions. I've kept asking myself, well, why didn't they just do it? Why wasn't neurosurgery checking them? I had so many questions. And after I did the speech, this woman came up to me and introduced herself. And I'm not going to say her name because I don't want any hateful rhetoric directed at her whatsoever. But she came up to me and she introduced herself and she said, I was the doctor there that day. I'm the one that did your trach. And I was shocked because when I was in the hospital after that day, we never saw her again, ever. I'm sure that was the hospital, trying to mitigate all of that, because essentially I've spoken around this in circles for a long time. They made a mistake. There was a mistake made. There just was. That's just the facts. But this doctor came up to me, introduced herself, and the first thing she said when I realized who she was, she said, I just want to tell you that your husband was fighting for you. And I just smiled and I said, well, that's what I've heard, because apparently he was like screaming at her that day. And I had got to talk to my neurosurgeon also that day, and I had asked him, how did this happen? How did this get missed? And he said that was when I found out that I had already been released from neurosurgery because I didn't have a brain injury. So they followed protocol. They didn't do anything wrong. And if they scanned every patient's head in neuro ICU that said they have a headache, they would just have to have a CT scanner in every room, because you're in neuro ICU. Your headaches are a thing. But because of that, because they now have this documented case, of delayed onset of hydrocephalus, they have changed their protocols about when neurosurgery releases a patient. So it's not like it just happened and they were like, oh, okay. They've changed protocols from it. They've learned. And it really came full circle when I got to talk to that doctor. I got to tell her that, well, she first told me who she was. She was the doctor that did this. And then she told me that she was so glad to see how well I was doing, and that was the most horrific thing in her career. She's never experienced anything like that. And I got to tell her, I hate to use the word forgive because it's not like she was asking for forgiveness, but I got to tell her that I hold no ill will about it because she made a mistake. She wasn't negligent. She made a mistake, and I'll tell you why that resonates with me so much. Early on in my career as a paramedic, I had a 911 call for a hospice patient. This patient was on hospice for Alzheimer's, and the complaint was altered mental status. And I was like, really? This is so, like, why? Like, when you take a hospice patient to the ER, like, they get kicked off of hospice. It's a whole thing. But to call 911 for altered mental status on an Alzheimer's patient who was on hospice was just, I was so irritated. So I was a terrible paramedic that day. I think I took a quick set of vitals, and by vitals, I mean heart rate, blood pressure. That was it. Patient was nonverbal. Patient was out there. So we just had an easy ride to the hospital. The patient's blood sugar was in the 30s. That patient got some D50 in the hospital and discharged home and was doing much better. I was negligent in that call. I did not do the test that I should have done. I made a diagnostic error. I just completely screwed that up, and I never forgot it. I can promise you, I never again let that happen in my career. I learned from it because I felt so bad. I felt so stupid. I felt horrible. Just, it was the worst feeling. I felt awful. And I knew that doctor had to feel the same way that I felt with that patient. And I got to tell her that I'm okay, and that I know that you learned something that day, and that will never happen to another patient in your care. And she started tearing up, and we both cried a little bit and hugged, and I got to get much needed closure on that day. Before that day, I thought about this constantly, and I always had questions. I just couldn't fit it all together. But because of that conversation with her, I was able to move on. I still have issues with PTSD every once in a while, but for the most part, I feel like I can finally let it be. This is what happened. It was horrible, but this is why it happened. They learned something from it. Hopefully this will never happen again, and move on with my life. One thing about that I do get asked a lot, and I will go ahead and answer in this podcast, is that people often ask me if I had a near-death experience, meaning did I have any kind of spiritual event during any of that, and the answer is no. The day of my accident, it was just light switch were turned off, and pretty much the same during the brain herniation event. There was fading away, then there was nothing, then there was torture, and then there was nothing again until I woke up from the coma. So I know that's not the answer a lot of you are looking for, but you guys ask me that all the time, and I'm just being honest with you that is what I experienced. But this event was the Kickstarter so to speak, of my mental downhill spiral, which we will get into on next week's podcast. I will tell you a lot about that and what all happened with that. And then I will tell you about the wonderful nurses I had and what they did to try to bring me out of that. I think you guys will really enjoy it. It's really special. And I will tell you that it has been featured on a nationally syndicated primetime TV show on their season finale. And so we will talk about that. And I will show you all the pictures and the real story and what the show did. But I would like to take this opportunity to give a great big shout out to all of my members listed here. You guys are amazing. I cannot thank you enough for your support of me and this channel and your encouragement along the way. And you guys are just rock stars. And I appreciate the heck out of you. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. I will see you next Thursday on Wednesday for my members. But for the rest of you, I will see you guys again on Thursday. Until then, stay safe, stay spicy, or just stay.